In this video, we are briefly going to talk about ethics and boundaries. We will go into this in more detail when we meet in person. We will review what I've talked about here, and then we'll go more in depth as well with some scenarios. So ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior. So we will be talking about ethics, of course, in relation to how to behave as a peer support member. And then boundaries are a limit of a subject or sphere of activity. So what kind of limits will you have as a peer support person? What do those boundaries look like and how to have really healthy boundaries? So I want to just mention really the most critical pieces here. First, regarding peer support ethics, confidentiality is the number one, absolutely most important value, and it really is a boundary as well regarding peer support. So the idea is that once you are affiliated with a peer support team and are a peer support member, you essentially give up the right to gossip. So that's the best way to be sure that the way that you are conducting yourself is going to be in a way that has strong ethics and boundaries. Confidentiality is the way that you could most easily really sink or ruin a peer support team. So one, breach of confidentiality could absolutely end a team. I've heard of it happening before, and so this single piece alone is reason enough to want to make sure that we talk about this piece before we even meet in person and talk about it further. So if it's very common to gossip, to engage in it, to initiate it. I've heard that a lot of that goes on generally in law enforcement, but to completely remove yourself from those scenarios is going to be important. Certainly to never initiate them, and then also definitely not to engage in it when it's happening around you. So you can choose how you handle that. If you change the subject, if you just contribute neutral statements, what it means is that if you remove yourself from any of that, it's going to build trust in your peers that that isn't something that you do, and they won't then have to worry that you may do that about them. And so, of course, the entire role of a peer support member is based on trust and rapport building. And so you essentially need to always conduct yourself in a way that will continually build trust and rapport over time. So if you haven't always been perfect in this way, don't worry. That's many many people, most people, in fact. But behavior change over time equals trust. And so if in this moment you stop any gossiping, you'll also notice a more positive attitude, probably because the only things you'll find yourself saying will be about yourself or about things generally, not aimed at certain people. You can speak to yourself very with high integrity, of course, because you are the official on yourself, not on anybody else outside of you. And so you can essentially um, have more confidence in yourself, and then others will have more confidence in you. So that confidentiality piece is the number one most important one. And then the next piece here for peer support is non-judgmental attitude. That goes along with confidentiality and with with giving up the right to gossip. So gossip also tends to include judgment. It requires an attitude of judginess towards other people, whoever are being gossiped about or talked about. It's usually in a negative way. Talk about people in a positive way, all that you want to, as long as you're not breaking confidentiality. But generally, taking a non-judgmental attitude is a really good way to be sure that you're keeping your own values, opinions, and biases to yourself. The way that you see things or opinions that are personal to you or takes that you have is very often not helpful, and in fact can keep somebody from opening up to you if they feel they are going to be judged because of you feeling a strong way yourself. So it isn't that you can't have opinions and values and biases, but in your conversations with your peers, especially when you're providing peer support, it's important to think through how this might look differently for you to refrain from jumping in and sharing your values and opinions. If somebody's talking to you about something very personal to them, it's fairly irrelevant where you stand on some of that stuff. So boundaries, we'll talk about all of that more when we meet in person. Peer support boundaries is really about the limits of your role and also kind of the complicated ways that peer support can overlap sometimes with either dual relationships or conflicts of interest, which we'll get into more. We will talk through scenarios and it's really essentially about staying in your own lane. So you don't want to overreach in peer support, just like you don't want to burn out because you're not taking care of yourself. You don't also want to do more than your role appropriately allows. So you aren't a therapist, you aren't a counselor. I think it's a misnomer that the statute uses that word because counselor tends to indicate someone is a licensed provider of mental health care, and that's not true for peer support. They are trying to recognize this higher level of confidentiality that they're wanting to give, which is helpful, but it also can be misleading. So keep a close eye on that. So, you aren't a mental health provider and you aren't expected to be either. You're just expected to be a peer with some specific training. And so there are incredible, very helpful, super supportive things that you can see and that you can notice and cues that you can pick up on, and things you'll learn what to do about when you see these things. But you don't want to overstep your boundaries in your role because that could end up hurting somebody. So we'll talk about what exactly that means, when to refer, what would indicate that something is outside your lane, and really it's important to refer on. Dual relationships, this would be if you are maybe a sergeant and a peer support member. It might be that in that type of dual relationship, you only provide peer support to other sergeants and maybe not to patrol or investigators. That isn't necessarily the way it needs to be, but you of course have a position you're in when you are a sergeant that sometimes policy and things you would have to break confidentiality about is going to be different than if you are peer supporter who is patrol or investigations or whatnot. So being aware of the hierarchy issues there is important. We can talk more about that. And then conflicts of interest. So if you are, it's potential, there is potential that you may not be a good fit to provide peer support to someone because of a conflict of interest. Maybe you are also dating them, or maybe part of what they're struggling with is, something to do with you, and that creates some kind of conflict for you or them or their best interest. And so we can talk more about how that looks, how that can play out. We'll talk through scenarios, and we will definitely spend some more time on this piece since it's so incredibly important. Like I said, if there's one single thing that's most important of all for ethics and boundaries and generally for peer support, it's confidentiality. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure I'll be back with you soon.